Okay, good morning, everybody. My name's Steve Zurier. I'm a freelancer and a contributing writer for SC Media, among other cybersecurity publications. I've been covering technology for 30 plus years, and I want to welcome you all to CISO webinar and the impact of the evolving cybersecurity compliance on business. Today we have a really great panel, some real experts on the regulatory environment and the types of issues that security pros are facing. So I'd like to start by going around the room and start by introducing Ira Winkler.
Yep. Hi there. My name's Ira Winkler. I'm the field CISO for Sci and wrote a few books and just get around. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. Reuven.
Hi everyone, I'm Rubi Aronashvili. I'm the founder and the CEO of Sci. Coming from a military background where I started as the founder and the head of the Israeli Red Team, then the Israeli Incident Response Team, and then founded Sci in 2012, since then serving as CEO, and happy to be here. Looking forward to a great discussion.
Yeah. Kate.
Hi everyone, I'm Kate Keene. I'm the Chief Trust Officer for Aon. Been around cyber for a couple of decades now, and just love being in great panels like this. Thank you for having me.
And Mike Wilkes.
Hello, yeah, Mike Wilkes. I'm a NYU Adjunct Professor. I teach cybersecurity. I'm a member of the World Economic Forum's quantum security working group, and also consulting out of Amylite Analytics at the moment, out of Canada. And so I'm really excited to share some thoughts and hear some questions from the audience today.
Well, that's great. So as you can see, we have just a very high-powered panel here. Lots of good background, people from the Israeli backgrounds in the Israeli military, World Economic Forum. Kate's very involved in cyber regulations and focused on mid-sized businesses. And Ira has a background as the former CISO of Walmart. So let's start today. Let's set the landscape of the regulatory environment, and what is it about just all the different regulations coming out, and how are people able to make sense of it all, and what's really important, like of the various regulations. We know that there's an FTC regulation, an SEC regulation. We know about regulations coming out of Europe, but what should people really focus on? How do you separate the wheat from the chaff and understand what's really important to your business? Kate, let's start with you.
You know, we're in an interesting time, Steve, and you know, I'm a child of the 70s, and I liken what's going on from a regulatory environment to, you know, where the auto industry was back in the 70s. So I was born, and my parents had a beautiful lacquer wood box, and they put the box in the back of the station wagon. And just for you, it was a wood paneled station wagon. It was an amazing station wagon. And they put a blanket and a bottle, and they put the baby in the box in the back of the station wagon. And that was totally fine as the box slid around the back of the station wagon as we went all over the country. In today's world, that would be unheard of. That would be, you know, let's call the police and child negligence and everything under the sun if you put a baby in a wooden box in the back of a station wagon in today's world. The regulatory environment for cybersecurity, the cybersecurity market is we are the station wagon with a baby in the back of the station wagon living in a box. And the reality is that we're trying to, with all these different regulations, make our cyber community safer. We're trying to put the airbags in place, the seat belts in place, you know, the anti-lock brake system, and we've created a bit of not an alphabet soup. Mike, what type of soup is it? Because I loved what you said in the pre-call.
I like to call it TLA soup, because TLA is a TLA for three-letter acronyms, right?
Exactly, three-letter acronym soup that is really confusing. So we now have a scenario where we have, a number of myriad of regulations, both localized, global, in country, you name it, and trying to sort out whether, you're being impacted because of industry, if you think of HIPAA and HICFA, whether you are being impacted because of the type of company you are, like the new SEC rules from a public perspective. Are you, more concerned from a consumer-facing perspective with the FTC and the new concerns around the penalties that even go down to cyber negligence and criminal liability? It's really difficult to kind of see, in essence, the forest through the trees. And so I think what's most important is to really get a baseline understanding of the motivation behind the regulations and what are the high points, and then how do we start working together to build a more holistic global picture that is easier for organizations to consume and understand. Similar to, again, what happened in the audio industry. We don't have 50 different types of seatbelts, we have one. We'll get there.
I'd like to extend your analogy one little iota for asset management. We don't actually know that we have 3 kids in the back of the station wagon right now. We think we have 1, because there's a lot of assets that people don't know that can be attacked. But I love the analogy there.
Well, I have 5 kids in the back of the station wagon, which is why I drive a really big minivan. All right, Steve, hopefully that was a good kickoff.
Yeah, it's good. Mike, why don't you pick up? What should people like? How do people sort this out? Like if you're General Motors and a large industrial manufacturer, or if you're a large bank and you have fiduciary responsibilities and have to file with the SEC, what should you be focused on versus a small real estate broker? Because it seems like there's different avenues and different kinds of regulations targeted for different sectors.
Yeah, I think it's useful to classify the size of the organization and the industry, like Kate was saying. Organizations that count as enterprise might be 1,000, might be 10,000, employees and up. They're already going to have a CISO, hopefully. They're already going to have a chief risk officer, potentially. They're already going to have, incident response teams. They're going to have outside counsel. They're going to have, capability to light up a digital forensics and incident response third-party contract to investigate a breach, especially if it's an insider threat, for example, and there might be a criminal case. You have to maintain chain of custody. So there's a whole scale difference in terms of maturity of the organizations that are being hit with the new SEC disclosure and reporting rules. And I think all of them are like, I have no idea what we're going to do, because as of December 18th, your Form 8K will have to include item 1.05. And I've been writing about this on my LinkedIn, and I actually reverse analyzed, the Microsoft proxy logon breach from a couple of years ago, and said, guess what? This is kind of funny. Short anecdote. If that breach were to happen now, right, which was a vulnerability in Microsoft on-prem Exchange called proxy logon, the funny thing that happened, the odd thing that happened was, besides hundreds of organizations getting compromised and having backdoors and web shells installed, the Department of Justice gave the FBI permission in April of 2021 to go in and use the vulnerability to unhack hundreds of companies that hadn't patched for this vulnerability, which is unprecedented, right? Because it's a change control violation, number 1, for all those companies. And they would all now have to file a Form 8K where they would say the threat actor was the FBI, because the FBI breached their security and made an unauthorized change on their Exchange servers. And so I think the absurdity of playing out what this is going to look like for the next 12 months, 24 months is useful to try to think about some of these scenarios, because it's not just data breach and integrity of the information that might be disclosed through a ransomware or data exfiltration. It's also a DDoS attack. And so when Azure was DDoSed for a couple of days, Microsoft's going to have to write a Form 8K, and they're going to have to eventually use inline XBRL, which is a tagging format, and report and disclose this within 4 days. Now, what's interesting in the case of a DDoS, that's publicly observable. We all know that Azure's not responding, and you can see the network traffic and the net flow. But for other events that are behind closed doors, that's when the company has to decide what's a material incident. And we can get into the definition of materiality in the SEC's use case, but they left it vague, I think, on purpose. They want each company to come up with their own definition. But for smaller organizations, that don't have an SEC mandate and don't have some of these other higher order like HIPAA for healthcare or PCI for payment card industry. These smaller organizations just have to sort of read the writing on the wall and say, guess what? I guess we're going to have to get a SOC 2, right? That's like the minimum compliance type attestation that most companies need to have to be considered quasi-trusted, which means you have a response plan, you have, antivirus and other things like that. So I think that the difficulty that a lot of organizations are facing right now is, there's so many people pulling in different directions. If you're an international company, you have to deal with DORA, you have to deal with, Canadian bills that are coming up, and everyone's trying to harmonize, and it's not yet harmonized. We were talking a few minutes ago about how it's just a bit of a cacophony, right? No one's playing the same song, they're not playing at the same tempo, and they didn't start at the same time. And yet all of these regulatory bodies are pursuing the same ostensible good outcome, which is better transparency, better visibility into our attacks and our mitigations.
Right. Can we maybe define what the SEC had in mind with the describing a material breach? I mean,
Yeah.
The most I can get out of it, maybe Kate could take that, but the most I can get out of it is that it's something that a material breach is some kind of incident that it would impact the shareholders.
Ira, you sounded like you were going to jump in there real quick before I go.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, in general, that's part of the problem where the material breach was not really well defined. It's something that could theoretically impact shareholders, whether it's to impact the stock price, for example, at some point in time because of an outage. It's something that would, I think vaguely it implied if it could impact the reputation or could impact how someone would invest. I mean, to me, that sounds like a golden ticket for class action attorneys, which is my major concern. Because there are some organizations, for example, like an enterprise, that, they might have a $10 million incident because something happened to the website. That happens frequently where you can't do business on the website for a short period of time. And generally, that's kind of written into the whole plan of a large organization. And likewise, you expect websites to theoretically go down at some point in time just because it's the internet. The internet goes down, and so do websites on a somewhat, I don't want to say frequent basis, but on a periodic basis, it's expected. Now, the problem comes up with a smaller organization. Okay, where can somebody argue is a material breach? Like, for example, a large organization can take a $10 million hit for a short period of time. Smaller organizations, if they can't accept email, theoretically, customer service goes down. You could theoretically say a class action attorney will come out of the woodwork to sue them because customer service was possibly impacted and the company didn't disclose a small email outage due to an Azure issue or a router going down for a short period of time. The concern is the definition of materiality is vague, which helps some organizations, but at the same time, in my opinion, it broadly opens them up to the vagueness where, I could just see attorneys coming out and finding companies to sue, which happens on a fairly regular basis with PCI, FCRA regulation related issues and so on. And that's my primary concern. But to your point, what is a material incident? It's a legal answer. It depends.
Right.
And that's part of the biggest problem.
It actually is, and I think this is important as we think about the regulatory landscape and where we're all trying to head and what companies should think about, because this was actually supported by the Supreme Court. Materiality in the SEC cyber rule, and I went to go grab it right off the website, affirmed by the Supreme Court and maintained in regulation, indicates that the information is material if there is substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would consider it important. A reasonable shareholder, and that there's actually three types of materiality: overall materiality for financial reporting, overall performance materiality, and specific materiality for classes of transactions. So those are the three. the critical thing to then in all of that is the shareholder. And what would a shareholder, would it impact stock price? And this comes to the other side of the SEC, which is, I think, something that as an industry we need to think about, which is raising the education and the awareness of our boards and our executives to understand what materiality actually really should mean from a translation perspective of shareholder. So what I mean by that is cyber incidents have become operational incidents. Technology lives in all areas of an organization, which means cyber resilience is now operational resilience. And the reality there is when there is a problem from an operational resilience perspective, there can be an impact to the stock price, positive or negative. And what we're seeing here is that, from a cyber perspective, what the SEC is trying to do is, one, push to hold more accountability from an executive perspective to better understand how they respond to material impact to the business that's going to impact the share price and the shareholder. And two, do it in a way that still understands or lives within our bounds of world, because cyber is very different when you think about, in correlation to shareholders. It's a really different type of a scenario. We're at this crash course with all of these regulations. And, Reuven, with your background in the military, I'm interested, to kind of get your view on it, because it's a different type of methodology. We're dealing with the fact that regulation right now is trying to marry business driver and business impact, if you think about share price, and operational efficiency, elegance, and responsibility, best practices, creating a cyber framework. And I think we still have, to Mike's point, this 3-letter acronym soup of all these different things kind of in the middle. And we have to do a better job of creating single swim lanes that make it, a very clear path to understanding for our organizations, because we don't have that right now.
Yeah, I can tell you even more than this. One of the things, sorry, Steve, just 1 second. One of the things that are interesting in the discussion here, you talk about share price and impact, right? That's those are the consequences of an attack. That's already after effect, right? Now, you ask yourself, when do you need to decide whether the incident is material, right? Let's assume that you had something very small, just like Ira mentioned, just not even 10 million, 1 million of an impact on your organization, something very small that you don't consider to be material. But then Elon Musk decided to tweet about it, right? And now it becomes a huge issue. Now the stock value is really impacted. Are you now in a situation that you are violating the situation or not? Because it wasn't material before. It is material now, right? Because the cost of the stock value is definitely significant when you look at the shareholder. That's something that has significant impact. And now you need to ask yourself, when was the right reporting time? And compare it to the military life that we had, there, from our point of view, material was human lives. Very simple, right? Cost is cost, money is not an issue. It's all about whether you're able to block terror activities, whether you're able to identify the next suicide bomber in your environment, or whether you're able to identify that with your cybersecurity capabilities that you have out there. So being able to identify what is material in the army was actually better defined, right? Because then you know exactly what impact is and how impact is being treated. So I think in this vague definition, as Mike mentioned, I don't see how the industry is able to react to it, let's say, efficiently, when we don't have very clear measurable items that we can actually measure. If you take your own definition, then you go exactly to where Ira mentioned. You will face multiple lawsuits, and that will open the door for chaotic situation that will, again, create maybe a negative effect rather than the positive effect that we want to generate with, adding the resilience level to the organization. So from my point of view, definitely more accurate definition, measurable definition is required.
So what would that more specific definition look like? I'll open that up to anybody.
I love Mike talking about the 4 cybersecurity outcomes. I think that's a good point. Mike, Mike's been putting some things in the chat that I think we should be bringing out and talking about.
Sure. Before we go into what's good and what can we do, let's bash on the SEC's rule a little bit more. And I say this tongue in cheek, but I'm trying to think about some specific outcomes where I don't know that the 4-day rule is actually having an impact or is going to help. Is it going to reduce the likelihood of a breach? No, because disclosure is a post-breach event. Is it going to help us detect a breach faster? No, because detection occurs before disclosure, right? Is it going to ensure compliance? Yes and no. I mean, setting a 4-day rule simply shifts the compliance target, right? You've already had 72-hour rule for GDPR. All 56 US states and territories have their own disclosure requirements. That's part of the cacophony going on right now around regulatory. You know, if you operate in Texas, you have to have 10,000 records lost in a breach to report to the Attorney General. And in California, it's like 500. I think it was 500. But anyway, and New York is totally different. You know, I even looked up, you know, Puerto Rico and Guam and other places to make sure that we're not just talking about the 50 states. And then finally, the security outcome of defending your brand. No, I don't think a 4-day disclosure rule is going to help. You know, it's not going to improve your brand with your investors. And if they are trying to influence the market and make the market more intelligent and more transparent, none of these outcomes are impacted by a 4-day disclosure rule.
But isn't part of it just setting some guidelines for the types of cybersecurity requirements that companies need to be able to respond? I mean, I think at a certain level, large companies already have, like you said before, large companies already have CISOs, but it seems like one of the goals or one of the aims of any regulation is just to set rules of the road for like what are some of the best practices. Well, I think most of the regulations do a good job with that.
Well,
you're dead right.
Go ahead. Okay, so I was gonna say, here's my problem, or what I see the benefit of regulations, and the problem is that good organizations are already doing most of what's there, the reporting and things like that. I mean, fundamentally, you know, you say cybersecurity incident, the good boards already know that if the computers go down, supply chain goes down, that is something that automatically has to be written into other documents, whether or not there's a cybersecurity regulation. You know, the smaller I'll give an example. When PCI first came out, one of my friends was CISO of a retailer. No, it wasn't Walmart. And no, I wasn't CISO of Walmart. I was the chief security architect there, just for the record. But anyway, what happened was this CISO, I was talking to her and I was like, how's it going? She's like, do you know how hard it is to get encryption for a mainframe? And I was sitting there, I go, I have no sympathy for you. Because she's like, what? I go, look, here's the thing. You're telling me you probably have millions of credit cards sitting on your mainframe, unencrypted, just sitting there. And she had a clue. I'm not going to lie. She was a good CISO, brilliant cybersecurity practitioner. However, what I'm seeing for regulations in general, and why I'm usually a fan, I'm not necessarily a fan of this one, of like of the SEC at the moment, because it's so vaguely written. But the problem is that for many organizations, they have nothing. And some rule like we have now at least sets a minimum bar for people, if it's well written. So if you don't have, again, in the absence of what specifically organizations should do, a lot of organizations unfortunately do the minimum acceptable to get by with business without any established processes, procedures, or whatever else. Now, in a good way, the organizations that are not very good at cybersecurity, frankly, are going to be more impacted. They're going to have to put a CISO in place. They're going to have to talk to their boards about cybersecurity, which frankly, everybody on this call, and I think people watching, know they should be doing already. A good CISO already has regular time with board members, with the audit groups and everything else. The other companies that value as well are going to need to start valuing them. But it's setting a minimum bar. But in this case, it's not just setting a minimum bar. It's setting a minimum bar with very vague goals for people to figure out. And again, I don't like the fact it opens people up to lawsuits. You know, it should be there to establish a good baseline, not to say, hey, this investor is clearly reasonable and they want to know when Joe, the assistant to the CEO, did not go ahead and receive an email from the CEO in a timely manner because there was a network issue from their home computer.
So
This
what
is
kind
what
of
we're opening up ourselves up to at the moment.
what kind of specifics are you looking for? Like, what, I'm not. I understand what the criticism is, but what would be like an example of a fix, or 1 or 2 points?
So
Well,
can I jump in for a second? Because I have a really good one.
Yeah, no, please jump in. And I know Kate likes to disagree with me a lot. So
I was going to say, Ira,
I'm all for.
Ira, we might have to, I don't know, hell might freeze over. You and I just agreed. This is the first time in webinar history of the two of us that I actually completely agree with you, and I'm not going to argue with you. It's amazing. Steve, you've done a miracle if Ira and I are agreeing on something. No, you're right. The reality is we need to have a baseline, and there needs to be, in essence, kind of a cyber, in essence, framework that is a base level of good. The funny part is I actually really love what CISA, the work CISA did, and obviously it needs some tweaks earlier this year with the Cyber Preparedness Guide, the CPG, as a recommendation on a cyber baseline. I thought it was excellent, especially for the middle market. And I would love to see that pushed into more regulation. How we approach, because I know a lot of the people that are listening to this call are going to say, well, what should I do to be prepared? The first thing on the SEC, and Ira, you said it really well, is the communication planning for a large organization. We do talk to the boards about cyber. We do have regular briefs. We do have communication. But the reality of the situation is, unless you've actually battle tested how you're going to execute a new disclosure, it's really difficult to make sure you're prepared, and what type of things. Because to everyone's point, the nuances of what is materiality here, there's going to have to be some new guidelines for organizations on comp planning and how they actually report. So my advice is, if you are going to be impacted, or you want to be looked at being, the same kind of compliance areas of aligning with the new SEC regulations, is to have a preparedness assessment done. Are you prepared to address and look at the SEC guidelines? There's a number of organizations that do them. I don't think you need to have it down to the level of legal preparedness, because hopefully you have a good in-house counsel or an external counsel that can do it. But do you have the right, in essence, remediation steps of being able to report and execute in the timeframes and guidance appropriate? I think that's a really important thing. The second thing, Ira, to your point, is the White House has out right now the harmonization RFI, which is due the end of this month, for feedback on how do we create a more simplified version of all these regulations. And understanding that we have different industries, different levels of organizations, things like that. So if an organization hasn't had it done, again, having an assessment of your regulatory stance. What should you be thinking about? What should you be doing? How should you be approaching the board? What are the actual best practices? I always think it's good for especially mid-sized organizations to do that every couple of years. Have a corp threat assessment, have a regulatory assessment, know who finds you appealing, and know what regulations you're supposed to be standing up to, and are you doing a decent job with it. The last thing I'm going to say is, as we think about the regulatory landscape and how we approach some of the new things that are happening out there, is, I hate to tell everybody this, we're at the tip of the iceberg. I have regulation fatigue. We've been doing this a long time. Think about SOX, think about Graham-Leach-Briley, HIPAA, HICFA, there's a lot. But the reality here is there's going to be more before there's less, and there's going to be more global participation. And so, understanding not only your financial, but your legal from a criminal perspective stances on these, and making sure that you stay ahead, is going to be critical for organizations, especially cross-border multinationals. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. Ira, if you agreed with me, then we definitely have a problem, because this never happens.
But Kate, let me ask you a question here, Kate. Do you think that the regulator or the government, they have a role also in providing some kind of clear guidance or some kind of support to the organizations to actually be able to comply with the requirements, because providing the regulations or the compliance framework, that's one thing. Helping organizations, any kind of help, would be another step that at the moment it's very hard for those organizations. The number of questions that I'm getting, what do we do next, right? That's something that shows that the industry is not prepared. What kind of support do you think that the government or the regulator should provide in order to support the industry?
So I'm gonna say a very controversial answer. I think the government is doing a very good job of trying to bring the right people to the table, because there's a lot of warring factions here. You have a lot of organizations that are out for self-interest. You have a lot of organizations that are trying to create a baseline cyber maturity, and you have other factors and influence. We have things like AI coming into the marketplace. We have things like blockchain, emerging tech, that are really distracting the holistic purpose of creating a baseline of measurable cyber maturity that makes the marketplace a safer place. I think, and this is Kate Keene, not Kate Keene Aon, whatever else, thinking that you're going to see this really hit from an insurance perspective. Here's why. The moment you're found cyber negligent from the FTC, the moment you are found not in compliance with the SEC, guess what's not going to be available to you? Your cyber insurance. Insurability is what drove, going all the way full circle back to my example with the auto industry. It was insurance that drove the regulation to change. And I think what you're seeing, my organization does a very good job of this. There's others as a broker of helping organizations look at what is this area of breach that's out in the world today? What are the things we're seeing? What are the controls that should be leveraged from a baseline cyber perspective? And how do you put those in place so that you have good financial transfer, which is insurance, avenues as part of your holistic operational resilience plan? The government, I think there's going to be a very symbiotic relationship between public and private as we solve for this regulatory concern, because insurance is literally 1/3 of the stool when you think about proactive, reactive, and then your financial transfer. And so if that magically goes away because you're non-compliant, that's a massive blow for all size organizations. And so you're going to see the brokerage and the insurance community have to be the ones to help kind of put the guideposts in place of what good maturity looks like, that then will trickle into the regulatory environment. I'm not saying that I work for a broker. I'm saying because from a trust perspective, it's the right thing to do. And we've seen for 100 years, different industries follow that same model.
I think it's interesting to touch on the insurance piece for a second. The top 5 cyber insurance, companies for the last couple of years have had loss ratios of like 120%, right? Because the work from home, all the claims being paid. So they're either going to stop writing policy and premiums are going to go through the roof. But you're right, if you do get fined and you do get sort of uninsurable, that's a fascinating, position to be in, because even just a few years ago, I would be able to write a $5 million policy by answering like 3 questions. Do you have antivirus? Do you have a firewall? Do you have backups? That's not even enough to calculate my digital equivalent of a BMI, right? When you walk into a doctor's office, they ask how much you weigh, how tall are you? They check your pulse to make sure you're not going to die in the next 5 minutes before the actual doctor comes in. Cyber insurance was not really doing a good health check previously, right? And you would just get 5 million here, 5 million there. The only people that knew that you had 2 policies would be the reinsurers, right? Who have the ultra objective perspective of all the claims and all the coverage. And there were no breach, disclosures. I think the SEC's report, right, when they disclosed this new ruling, they said there were only 35 Form 8Ks filed in all of 2022 that were material cyber breach incidents. Now, if we know that you or a third party is going to be breached, in the next year, and the likelihood is really high, I think it was like 80–90% of all companies in the last 2 years have had a third party that was breached, right? If you think about MoveIt, if you think about SolarWinds, Kaseya, and so how many Form 8Ks should we expect in 2024? Well, if there's 12,000 regulated entities for the SEC, I'm going to guess we're going to need at least 10,000 Form 8Ks that'll be filed next year.
So I want to jump in on so many levels. First of all, I'm sending you, we have the Aon Cyber Resilience Report that just came out, and it's breach, claim, and industry data. But two things. Actually, we're in a soft market now. It's much easier to get cyber insurance than it was even a year ago. And we're starting to see massive declines on year loss. Remember, I'm a broker, I'm not an insurer. I work with the insurers. But just a heads up on that, because we work with many different insurers. The market's actually changed pretty extensively over the last couple of years. Very interesting. But to your point, it's going to be a difficult scenario of how do you start to, and this year will be a really big litmus test of how many organizations are going to have to file a Form 8K. And how do we also deal with that filing process? If we have, 80% of all organizations, does the SEC have the ability to handle it? And what does that look like? That's a whole nother kettle of fish.
Edgar's going to fall over. But you can actually download, like Johnson Controls just filed a Form 8K and they listed it as item 801, other things, right? Because they had a ransomware attack and they disclosed it on the 27th of February. And I was looking at it, you can download, the zip file and the PDF and the inline XBRL. I'm like, there's no interesting tags that are going to be in there for a cyber incident. You're supposed to talk about scope of the impact, nature, and financials. None of which, of course, occurs in anyone's Form 8 case. So I think this is really going to be one of those things where regulatory comes in, sets the minimum bar as it should. Everyone hopefully is exceeding that minimum bar at some point. But the real precedent is going to be the first case that is set against this new rule, where someone is then fined for not disclosing.
Right. We're getting close to our 45-minute mark. What I was going to say is, can everyone just we'll go around the room and everyone could just talk about what they takeaways for CISOs, like how should, based on this information, based on the discussion today, and based on what they know about the regulatory climate, how should CISOs move forward? Ira, do you want to start?
So if I were going to advise CISOs on what they should be doing now, and as one technically, the thing is you need to start, number one, working with the board proactively and make sure they understand, because the large organizations, many large organizations do. I've learned never to make blanket claims. So anyway, many large organizations already have a good working relationship with the CISO. The smaller ones, some of the other large organizations that don't give cybersecurity its due, the CISO needs to use these, especially, and I would unfortunately say in the majority of organizations, to say, we are now potentially opening ourselves up to a whole new area of liability that we never had before, through regulatory fines, through potential lawsuits, and a variety of other things. It's time for the organization to start taking, assuming they're not, taking cybersecurity much more seriously, because now there's a different, frankly, this regulation to many organizations is going to be considered a threat. And we didn't even talk yet about the threat of actually releasing attack information within 4 days, because that in and of itself could open you up to other types of attacks, because people know you're open. You might have to disclose the vulnerabilities and other people could come after you. So anyway, that aside, we need to start looking at it strategically and figure out how do you proactively get the support you need to go to the board, to make sure the board understands what are good cybersecurity oversight concepts. And there's a variety of things. Mike has classes, for example, on that. There's a variety of other organizations that offer classes, and the CISO needs to make sure these organizations do that proactively with their board members to get the appropriate knowledge. Now, at the same time, I'm going to start to say they really need to, and I hate people going in with FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But in many cases, there is a lot of uncertainty that they need to go ahead proactively with and highlight to the board, and frankly, get them to sign a document or at least have some sort of paper trail to acknowledge that they are trying to make the board aware proactively of these concerns. Because too many people might be put out as a scapegoat, or frankly, at the same time, you know, Tim Brown, a great guy, he's being accused of, I'm frankly not sure exactly what he's being accused of being overconfident in his security program. We need to go ahead and make sure that the CISOs are protecting themselves, but protecting the organization at this point, mostly with good information and doing what they can to get the support they need to put the proper programs in place. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, Tim Brown's an interesting case because you're talking about the SolarWinds CISO, right? And he didn't actually have any control over the programs that were engaged in the Wells notice that he was served. And this is the first CISO to be given a Wells notice. So he's like, WTF? I wasn't even in charge of the stuff that you're accusing me for, right? And it's fraud, right? Normally it's the CFO and the CEO that gets a Wells notice for defrauding the investors. Now, remember what happened in the case. There was a $26 million lawsuit settled against SolarWinds, and it was paid out of D&O, right? Directors and officers insurance. So I think the subtext there is, you know, accountability avoided, right? No one was held accountable because they just paid it out of D&O. But yeah, that's a good example to think about the CISOs. I would just offer, where are you going to home your risk register? So if you don't have a corporate risk register and the board doesn't review it every quarter, you're going to be found negligent, because that's one of the basic controls. You need some level of governance and discussion. If your quarterly earnings calls do not include the word security, if your annual report does not include the word security, you're going to look pretty bad, right? The Form 10K has to be filed for companies moving forward now as well. So I really want I want CISOs to think about who's the best champion for cyber and risk management. It could be the risk committee, it could be the audit committee, it could be ESG. There's all different homes for this discussion. And I think that's, you know, where do you get the top of the org chart? Start pulling their weight and actually contributing to good governance, rather than just sitting around like deer caught in the headlights. Cyber what?
Okay, you want to pick it up? Maybe you could talk about the role of boards, like what boards really need to be doing.
So I think there's a couple of things. You know, I agree wholeheartedly with what both Ira and Mike had to say. From a board perspective, there's a few things. One is trying to create a repeatable, transparent reporting process that goes between boards, because most boards have members that are on multiple boards. And right now we don't have a seamless, in essence, form or way that we're reporting cyber. So it becomes very murky in between companies. So that's one thing, is looking for best practices, work with organizations to help make it easier for your board members to digest cyber from one organization to the next. The second is, like I said, work with your CISOs to have a preparedness assessment. A board should understand, how prepared are you to respond to new regulation? What are the corporate threats, or what are the major things that you should be thinking of? And understanding holistically the difference between threat and risk, two very, very different things. The other thing from a board perspective is working and aligning and making sure your CISO understands the critical business objectives. If we're not addressing our cyber programs around our business objectives, but just on the threats we think might be concerning, we're really missing the mark, and we're going to be in a regulatory alphabet soup for not doing the right things. The other thing from a board perspective is education. And so working with organizations like, you know, digital directors and NACD and others to have a base level education of cyber and how cyber impacts operational resilience is critical, and making sure that you're on an annual basis educating your board onto what are the top things that you need to be thinking about, and how is the impact of that from both a communication planning and a risk perspective impactful to the organization.
Reuven, you want to take us home?
Yeah, so I mean, everything that was said here, of course, is to the point. But you know, just to add on top of that, one thing that you need to do as a CISO in order to be able to report, communicate, and discuss with the board, you need first to understand yourself, the organizational situation. I mean, you shouldn't take it for granted that the CISO actually understands the situation, meaning understanding the risk profile of the organization, the threat profile of the organization, to Kate's point, and of course, being able to communicate that in a language that the board can understand. For example, dollar and cents, right? Those are different types of communications that we don't see a lot of organizations, unfortunately, able to do today. So providing the board with a list of 200 vulnerabilities that are the most risky vulnerabilities, that's nice, but wouldn't be any help for the board. But saying this is our risk, this is what we expect to pay, this is the likelihood for that to happen, and that's what I need in order to take the organization from A to B. That's the way to communicate things in the boardroom, and also educating, to Kate's points before, educating the board to ask the relevant questions. That's something that we don't see a lot. Honestly, I can tell you that the questions that I hear a lot of times in a boardroom, those are very far away from mature questions to really be able to direct the CISO to find the right data items that you are looking for. So if I need to summarize, first, CISO, understand the organizational, get a grasp of your organizational risk profiling and threat profiling, translate it to the business risk and quantify that for the board, communicate it correctly, and do that on a continuous basis. That way you share the accountability. It's not only you, the CISO, that will be blamed. And then, of course, be able to communicate every time that you have a budget cut, every time that you don't get what you need, be able or be transparent with what are the consequences, and then accept the risk or transfer the risk or mitigate the risk. One of the three options. That's what you have to do. And from my point of view, if you have that very clearly defined in the organization, at least one step you manage to cover, and now you need to go to the next.
Okay, one thing I was wondering about, if we had any questions coming in from the audience.
I have the questions tab open. I don't see anything yet, but if someone does want to type a question for us, I'm happy to try to provide an answer. Kate, you mentioned Digital Directors Network and board certification and NACD. The 2023 NACD Cybersecurity Oversight Handbook for Directors is a really good read. I'll claim a little one-uppance here, though, because I worked on the World Economic Forum principles for governance that cascaded their way down into the NACD. And so there's also a World Economic Forum white paper that I helped work on that has 6 principles for modern governance of cybersecurity. And I love the fact that both NIST and NACD are focusing on governance, right? They're adding a 6th category to NIST CSF 2.0, be finalized next fall. Everyone should adopt NIST CSF if you don't have a framework, right? It's the good starter framework for everyone. And from there, how much can you bite off? How much can you chew? ISO 27001, or if you want to go for NIST 800/53 or 800-171, there's all sorts of frameworks and guidance out there. The worst thing is to just not have one yet that you've picked that you're trying to operate against. I think that's my advice, to the CISOs. And of course, run and flee because you're going to get thrown under the bus, right? I read a survey of virtual CISOs and CISOs recently. It said 2/3 of all CISOs are ready to quit. I think we should actually go on strike. We should go like the UAW and the Hollywood writers. All the CISOs should go on strike and say, you need us. Stop killing us.
I'm going to play devil's advocate there, and this is a different topic. But if CISOs want to quit, wish them well and get some new blood in there. We need experience, but we also need to grow experience too. And if somebody's burnt out, it's not, I'm not trying, well, it's going to sound political given everything, but you're not entitled to a position until you're 90 years old and die. If you're not feeling it, you're burnt out, give it a break, let somebody step in and, allow somebody to move their way up. But, especially with the new regulations, maybe it's a good time for some people to say, hey, instead of putting myself at financial personal risk that I've been, let's just say, got myself a nice nest egg through restricted stock units and other things, it's time to just sit back and let the new generation deal with the stress and now the lawsuits.
I think to your point, and maybe this will round it out and take it home, is, we use the analogy in the beginning of this call of the station wagon and, the box in the back of the station wagon. And we're trying to build the airbags, and we're trying to put in the seatbelts, and we're trying to, figure out how we're going to have the analog brakes. And I love the work. And Mike, I love what the World Economic Forum has done. Any help you need with the WEF, raise my hand. I will do anything I can. Love what the organization's doing. Also love what the NACD, and everyone was laughing because I just went like this is how close it was literally on my desk. Yep. And digital director, because we need to do this from a community perspective. Ira, you're right. The advice that I have to organizations is we're seeing an evolution. We're creating new things, whether it's from a regulatory perspective, trying to create the airbag, whether it's from a financial transfer perspective with different ways to look at cyber insurance and controls, and that's, the seatbelt. And then we have the role of the CISO. And instead of punishing our brethren, I've been a CISO, Ira, you've been a CISO. I think everyone on this call has either been or interacted with CISOs for a number of years now. We have to look at how we change the role. And what I'm seeing is this emergence of now this risk executive. I love this model where you have one person that's kind of overarching, and then you have the technical CISO, the compliance, the regulatory person, maybe your physical security, because our role has expanded to the point that one person can't do it all. I may be really good at talking about this stuff, but I'm not going to be able to talk about the new emerging threats on Tor, and then what do we do about this and that and the other? We need multiple people supporting. And so I think we're seeing an evolution of the role, and I'm interested to see where that goes over time. This and the regulatory piece that we talked about, the holistic alphabet soup acronyms, what's most important. The reality is for organizations to understand their business objectives, understand their landscape, and understand and support each other from a business and a technical innovation perspective to make sure they're doing the right things. And with that, regulatory compliance becomes a lot easier.
Great synthesis, Kate.
I try.
Enjoy speaking. For anyone that doesn't know DDN, it's Bob Zukas and Digital Directors Network. He's been doing these trainings and qualified technology executives for a while. He's the one that lit me on to the whole idea of let's focus on the top of the org chart. They're not doing enough yet.
I think he's with me in New York in a couple of weeks.
Oh, cool. Well, the World Economic Forum is always looking for sponsors and people to join in and pick up a shovel and try to write some of this governance documentation. So I'm looking forward to continuing my work with the Quantum Security Working Group and the Oil and Gas Resilience Industry Working Group.
Yeah.
But I think we're about done here because I don't see any questions coming in.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you guys very much for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, I think what Reuven was saying was worthy of one more repetition, I guess you could say. When you're talking to the board, you're having a totally different discussion than when you're talking technical as tactical with your developers and CVEs and vulnerabilities. And it's totally different when you're talking strategic with your cohorts, right? The head of legal, head of HR, VP of engineering. When you're talking to regulatory or the board, it's a third kind of conversation, and you can't just retreat to your comfort zone and talk about CVEs and things like that. That's just not their language. You have to talk dollars and cents and risk, and you have to pretend you're talking to my parents. And if you can use that language, to explain risk and mitigation of risk, then I think you can have an effective governance level discussion. And it has to be like Duplo blocks. I'm not insulting board members. They're mostly accountants and lawyers, right? But you need to make it that easy, right? Going back to the childhood analogy, how many kids are in the back of your station wagon right now? And can you explain to the board why they should have a seatbelt and a crumple zone?
Well, yeah. I mean, I just want to close because the big thing I've always said is the problem with cybersecurity is CISOs are getting the budgets they deserve, not the budgets they need. And they need to learn to deserve what they need. And tying that to what you said, Mike, the critical thing that I think is probably going to be the weakness of a lot of current CISOs, they don't know how to talk business at the board level. And that's something like, people say, oh, MBAs run the companies and that's a problem. Well, if a CISO needs to have MBA level vocabulary and acumen, even if they don't have an MBA, which is okay. But they are, especially with the new regulations and everything else, if they want to both protect themselves as well as to be valuable to the organization, they need to learn to talk business at the strategic level, at the board level. And, and frankly, a lot of CISOs need to do better than where they are at the moment.
Well, I like Kate's idea of just like putting together a team because it seems like this notion of risk is risk specialists is coming out of the accounting world and the consulting world, and maybe there's a way to blend that with the technical knowledge of a CISO.
Mhm.
Well, thank you, Kate and Steve, for moderating, and Reuven and Ira. Really great to share some Q&A with you and talk about all of these things about where we're headed and what's coming next. It's an interesting time, definitely, given the number of vulnerabilities and the number of attackers, and the fact that we don't have enough people defending. Ira, I do think there is going to be a changing of the guard, and some of the old school, so to speak, will have to die technically before we have fresh blood, in the boardroom.
Hey, wait a minute. I'm considered an OG in the cyber world. Hold on a second. Let's not start talking about death just quite yet.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Ira, I'll see you in the corn in a couple of days, my friend.
Yep, I will see you in the fields.
All right.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.